Good morning, United States. Welcome, Europe. Live from Turku for you. Vaadin 8 Loves Grails webinar with Jeff Brown from United States from OCI and Mac from Vaadin. We're going to introduce you to both Vaadin and Grails and show you how the two can really make you much more powerful web developers. So I'd like to introduce Jeff Brown from OCI. Jeff, could you tell a bit more about yourself and about OCI and the work you do there?
Okay, very good. Well, good morning and good afternoon to everyone again. So my name is Jeff Brown. I'm one of the co-founders of the Grails framework and the Grails practice lead here at Object Computing. OCI is headquartered here in St. Louis, Missouri in the U.S. The Grails team is the Caribbean Grails team here is a distributed team. We've got folks all over the world, but our headquarters is here in St. Louis, where I am. And so we're the folks who invented the Grails framework and the folks who develop it and support it and move it forward. We have a whole team of engineers that do project work with the framework as well as provide support to customers. We do all kinds of work around Groovy and Grails, really everything in the Groovy and the Grails ecosystem. We support Groovy, Grails, Gradle, and all the stuff in that ecosystem.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And sorry for asking you to do this a couple of times. Anyway,
no problem. I think we've got the technical hiccups out of the way, and we can charge forward now.
Yeah. So about Vaadin, for those who don't know Vaadin. Vaadin is both a company and a framework, a UI framework for developing web applications. So Vaadin as a company started and as a framework started in 2000. So it's already 17 years old. And the task that we as a company had in mind was always making the web development easier for developers. So the basic idea for the framework, with all the releases that we already have 8 major releases so far. So every time the task was simple: make web development easy for Java developers who don't want to get involved with HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So the basic premise of the framework is that you can develop a web application pretty much like you would a desktop application. And actually, let me show you a quick presentation of the features of the framework. So we're gonna have an introduction to Vaadin for those of you who don't know Vaadin yet. Then we're gonna talk about what's hot in the framework and how to get started with Grails and Vaadin. And I think we will have time for some question and answers. So you can go to the forum on our website, vaadin.com/forum. Then in the events section, there's a sticked topic on top of the section with today's webinar. You can post your questions there, and if there are any questions, we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. Okay, so what is Vaadin? The first thing about Vaadin is that it is a Finnish word because the company is based in Turku in Finland. We've got offices all around the world, but headquarters is in Finland, in southwest Finland. And Vaadin is a Finnish word that means female mountain reindeer. But of course, that's not what we're talking about today. Vaadin as a framework, as a user interface framework, is a framework destined at rich web applications. So what does it mean, rich web applications? Well, rich user interface components, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Since Vaadin itself is based on a concept of user interface components, and developing an application in Vaadin is basically combining those components, building a component tree, using things like combo boxes, data grids, rich text editor fields, and so on. Combining those by using other kind of components that are called layouts and building a component tree. This component tree resides on the server side, when you're developing a Vaadin application, when you're running a Vaadin application. And the framework itself takes care of actually rendering that in the browser and communicating the browser with the server side. So the only thing that you need is a Java virtual machine and a standards compliant servlet container, and the framework itself will take care of moving all that stuff from the server side to the browser and communicating the two together, so that when the user actually interacts with your application in the browser, you will get notifications about that on the server side, and you can react to those events. So that's the basic idea about Vaadin. There isn't much frameworks that work that way. Usually when you're developing a web application with other component-based frameworks, you develop separately the server side, and you develop separately the front end for your application, and then you need to code the communication layer between the two. But that's not how Vaadin works. Vaadin tries to hide the communication and client side from the developer. It is possible to go into that direction, but it's not necessary to develop a typical business-oriented application. So the two topmost goals that we want to reach is that the first thing is the developer gets productive with Vaadin. So basically this means that we want to remove obstacles and make it possible for the developer to code quickly and produce code with high quality. The other idea that we have when developing Vaadin is making the user experience rich, so that not only developers love the framework, but also the users of the applications that are developed with the framework love those applications. And this means, for example, that there is a very versatile theming framework that allows you to change the look and feel in whatever way you want, and skin your application to look precisely the way you want it to. Okay, so how do we achieve that? Well, we believe that Java or the JVM is the great place to develop web applications, and the HTML part of web applications is something that most Java developers don't want to deal with, so let's just hide it a bit. And you can see that in our logo as well. So our logo, it actually is a brace and an angle bracket. So brace is for Java, for code, Java code, and HTML is signified by this angled brace. But yeah, how to make it work? So the three key ideas is that we want to have a set of rich components. As I said before, we've got things like text edits, combo boxes, the data grid, which I would say, I'm not afraid to say that it is one of the most advanced data grids on the market that are available. But those are the components that are there, batteries included. Then the second thing is that the framework takes care of both server side and the client side. So you don't need to be bothered about the client side. It's just using components, and the rendering of those components is taken care of by the framework. So how does it work in practice? Let's take a look on some sample code. This is the code that you would write with Vaadin. So we've got some text field that is created here. We've got a button. We add those two to a layout so that they can be attached to the component tree, and then the framework can display those in the browser. And the final thing is that we need to have a click listener. So it's pretty much like in desktop frameworks, desktop UI frameworks, like in Swing or SWT. So when the user actually clicks on that button, we'll get a notification displayed in the application. So this is the code, and what happens when the user accesses the application written with this code is that, well, first of all, we need some initial HTML, the bootstrap HTML. For that, this needs to be downloaded from the server side to the browser. There is some CSS and images and the JavaScript. We call it the client-side engine. So this JavaScript is the browser part of the framework that takes care of rendering all the components that you defined on the server side. And if we compress that, this can go to something like 300 kilobytes, and that's everything that is required to run the application. So you don't need, the user doesn't need to download anything more when they progress in the application, like they change views or anything like that. It's just 300 kilobytes. And if you do some optimizations with the framework, there are tools in the framework for that, you can reduce the widget set, the client-side engine, to something like 135 kilobytes. So it's pretty small download. And this all is cached on the browser side. So it's downloaded only once, and then it's kept by the browser in place. So the user doesn't need to download it every time they access the application. Okay, so we've got this downloaded, the client-side engine is in the browser and it's running, and then the code that we wrote is being run by the framework. So the framework creates a new text field and a button, and those get displayed in the layout. When the user types something into the text field and clicks on the button, a small message, an AJAX message, encoded in JSON, is sent from the browser side to the clients, from the browser side to the server side, with the information what has changed since last round trip. So there are two changes in the state of components. The first one is that there is something typed into the text field, and then a button was clicked. And this message is really small. It's something like almost 300 bytes. And the framework on the server side receives that message and says, okay, so the button was clicked. We need to invoke the click listener. And that's what happens. This click listener that we defined in the code gets invoked. So there is an event, a click event, denoted by e variable here. And in this actual click listener, we want to show the notification that says hi, and then we want to get the value of the text field, the text that the user typed into the text field. So we've got this name.getValue, and the framework will actually take care of synchronizing whatever user typed on the in the browser, synchronizing that to the state on the server side. So name.getValue will actually return Jonas, the string that we typed here.
So Mac, that Java code that you're looking at there that describes the UI and some of the basic interactions that you're introducing, that has to be written in Java, or that can be written in any JVM language? Well,
you can use whatever JVM language works for you. I mean, the framework itself, it's a Java library, so it is distributed as a set of jars, and you can use Maven, you can use Gradle, whatever works for you. But that's Java, that's pure Java, and it runs on the JVM on the server side. So if you want to, you can use whatever other JVM language you want to. Like, if you prefer Groovy, that's completely fine. You don't need even to use Grails to use Groovy for coding the application. You can use Kotlin. There's actually quite a nice integration library for that. You can use Clojure, whatever works for you.
Yeah, so in the context of a Grails app in particular, a lot of folks will want to express this in Groovy code. And so that works out just fine.
Yeah, that will just work completely fine. And you can even use idioms from Groovy. So it's not a problem to write idiomatic Groovy code with Vaadin. Just works. Since this is just Java.
That is awesome.
Yeah. So we executed that that click listener. This click listener got executed on the server side, and as a response to the request that was sent before, the message is sent from the server side to the client side engine that says a notification should be displayed. So that's what happens. A new component is added on top of the application in the browser with the notification that says, "Hi, Jonas." And again, this message is also quite small. It's less than 300 bytes. And pretty much that's it. So that's how the application works in Vaadin. Every time user interacts with the application, there is a small message sent from the client side to the server, and then the server processes that message. If there is something that needs to be changed in the component hierarchy, just a message is sent from the server side to the client side, and that's it. So it all works. Okay, so the third idea, it's somewhat connected to what you asked before. The Vaadin framework is pure Java, so you can just use it in pretty much every JVM environment, and you can use it with any JVM language. It's just jar files that you add to the WAR file. So this also means that any language on JVM will work. The other thing is that we support a plethora of web browsers like Internet Explorer, Edge, latest version of Chrome, Firefox and Safari, and Opera. We also support mobile browsers out of the box, so Vaadin applications just run on those. And that's it. Your user doesn't need to install any browser plugins or anything like that. They just need JavaScript enabled on their browser, and that's it. And for the backend, you can use either servlets or portlets. If you're developing on LiveRate, for example, this will work fine as well. Just Java. That's just Java. Then you can use whatever tooling you want to. If you want to use Eclipse, that's fine. We've even got an official plugin for Eclipse that allows you kickstarting a project with Vaadin. There's a couple of starter projects that you can use. IntelliJ IDEA works very well. If you want to use NetBeans, that's fine as well. If you want to use any build tool that supports Maven repository layout, that works fine. I mean, you can use Maven. We've got Maven archetypes that help you start developing an application with Vaadin. Gradle works fine because it's just another dependency that you need to add. And if you use and, we've got you covered. If you use any other build tool that just can read a Maven repository, our artifacts are deployed to Maven Central, so you can just download it from there. So anything that works in Java world will work with Vaadin as well. And for using the backend, that's the other thing. You can use whatever backend you want to, since Vaadin is just a UI framework, nothing else. So this means that you can use Java EE, you can use Spring, you can use Spring Boot, you can use OSGI, you can have a separate REST endpoint on a different server and use that as a backend for your web application with Vaadin. And you can use, of course, you can use Grails as well. But everything that is Java will work with Vaadin. And the latest and greatest Vaadin is Vaadin 8.1. We also have a preview of a new version that is just around the corner. This is a developer preview, Vaadin 10 Alpha. This new version of Vaadin, this version 10, is actually going to be changing quite a lot. Why is it so? So up to Vaadin 8, we used a very specific tool for generating the client-side part of the application. So under the hood, Vaadin uses Google Web Toolkit. So you can use Java to develop on the client side if you want to as well. But with Vaadin 10, we're actually phasing Google Web Toolkit out because there are new standards that we want to follow, namely web components. So web components is a set of specifications for browsers that in general, they allow developers to front-end developers to develop their own custom HTML elements, and we think that is going to be the future of the web. So that's why we're moving from Google Web Toolkit to Web Components, and we're actually using a thin layer on top of the specifications, a library from Google that is called Google Polymer. This library is it's some sugar coating around the standards that are in the browsers, so it makes it a bit easier to develop new web components. And again, the framework itself, or the Vaadin 10 platform, will take care of communicating the browser side, the web components, with the server side, with the APIs that you want to use on the server side in Java or whatever JVM language you want to. But yeah.
Prior to Vaadin 10, with Vaadin 8, which is built on top of or behind the curtains, kind of uses GWT. Generally you'd be writing Vaadin code, not GWT code. But if for some reason you wanted to go one layer deeper and interact with the GWT stuff directly, is there a way to do that, or are you stuck?
Yeah, it's quite straightforward. So it's actually very straightforward. If you use, for example, Maven plugin or Gradle plugin for Vaadin, you just need to put your Java code for the client side in a specific folder, and that's it. So it needs to be, as Google Web Toolkit, as GWT requires it, it needs to be in a package that has client part name, and that's it. So it's not a big deal. And one reason for doing that might be if you want to develop a client-side widget that is not available from the framework itself. Like, let's say that you want to integrate a mapping component. We don't have a map component in the core framework, but if you want to, you can integrate an existing map component with whatever JavaScript or Google Web Toolkit code that you already have. So
what would with Vaadin 8, what would the motivation be for someone to use Vaadin versus just using GWT directly?
Well, I guess the most compelling reason for that is productivity. If you're developing a typical business web application, what you want to achieve is have something running, right, as soon as possible. So with Google Web Toolkit, you need to take care of 3 parts of the application actually. So you need to develop the client side. You need to develop the server side of the application. You need to have some endpoints that the client side that the front end would hit, right, and so on. And then you need to code around the communication as well. So you need to have 3 parts. You get the finer control, of course, but usually you just don't need that finer control. You just want to have something working just as soon as possible. So Grails and Vaadin, how to make those two work together so that you can have your productivity skyrocket. Actually, this is quite easy thanks to Spring Boot. Since every Grails application, every Grails 3 application is a Spring Boot application in disguise, there's not much to work on because fortunately Vaadin has an integration layer for Spring Boot. So I developed a profile that is called Web Vaadin 8 that actually takes care of pulling all the dependencies that you need, all the add-ons for Vaadin that are required to make it work with Spring Boot and hence with Grails 3 as well. So this Web Vaadin 8 profile, it is available from the official repository. So feel free to go to Bintray and find it there. Or then the other thing that this profile provides, apart from the dependencies that are required to make Vaadin work with Spring Boot, is a Gradle plugin for common tasks like packaging the application, taking care of the grid compilation if it is required, and so on. This Gradle plugin also takes care of compiling the theme for you, since when you're theming a Vaadin application, you're using you're probably best using SCSS. And we developed a theming framework for Vaadin around SCSS that is called Valo. But since this is SCSS, this is not something that a browser would understand, so you want to have this compiled when preparing a deployment package. So the Gradle plugin that is included in the profile will take care of that for you automatically. So you just need to build your application, and the WAR file will have it all. So how does it work? We've got a couple of Spring Boot auto configuration annotations in the Spring Boot starter add-on for Vaadin, and that's it. So it actually takes care of instantiating all the machinery that you need for Vaadin to work with Spring Boot. It also takes care of exposing parts of Vaadin as Spring beans so that you can interact with them or configure them, and that's it. So there is no magic there. There's nothing special about it. It's just Spring Boot auto configuration. You might wonder if there are any other options if you want to use Grails with Vaadin. Sure. At least one option is to code it all by yourself, which I wouldn't recommend. And then for previous versions of Grails, like for Grails 2, there is a very nice add-on. You can find it on GitHub. Okay, so now I would like to do some demo around the code that you write with Vaadin, so you can feel what is it like actually to write a Vaadin application with Grails. So the first thing is there is this web Vaadin 8 profile, so I'm gonna go and search for it. So yeah, it's here on Bintray. This is a repository where I deploy it to, but it is linked to Grails profiles repository as well. So you can just go into the terminal and create a new web application, new Grails application like this. Grails create app profile, and then you need to use this group ID. And profile, and we can use 0.4.
Mac, maybe it's worth mentioning that this the sample project that you're going to experiment with a little bit. There's a copy of this on GitHub under the Grails-samples organization, right? So
feel free to find it there.
Go to github.com/Grails-samples and search for Vaadin there, and you'll find the Vaadin Grails 3 demo.
So if you go to github.com Grails samples, it's on the top because it's the latest and greatest one. So
at the moment it's on the top, but folks have been watching the video for a long time, so just search for Vaadin if you don't see it near the top of the list, and you'll find it.
Yeah. So I've got this. So this simple incantation with Grails create app, it just fetches the profile for you from the official repository, and then it uses it to create a new Grails application. So that's the starting point you can use for developing, starting the development of Grails and Vaadin application. But I'm going to walk you through this sample that we have on GitHub. So I don't think we have time for live coding, so instead I will just jump into the project and show you around a bit so that you can understand what's happening there. So let's switch the project in IntelliJ. Okay. Yeah, I've got it here. So it's running. So I'm going to just go to localhost. So if I open the localhost as the application is running, you can see that it's a typical Grails starting screen. That's because Vaadin doesn't invade the Grails space with its own UI. Instead, you need to map your application to a specific path. So that's what we have here. Each and every Vaadin application needs to have a starting point, and this starting point is a class that extends a generic UI class. This class is basically like the root of your components tree, and this is the entrance point, the starting point for the application. Basically, what you need to do is you need to extend the UI class provided by the framework and implement one abstract method that is called init. This method accepts one parameter, the request, so that you can gather some information from this Vaadin request about the client side if you need to. But yeah, actually let's run the application. So as I said before, this application requires to be mapped. So we've mapped it to /Vaadin UI. Let's go to /Vaadin UI. And this is the application that I'm showcasing right now. So this is a very simple contact application. It has some contacts in the database already. There is a data grid that displays those contacts. If you click on a contact, it will display a form for editing this person details. Things like first name, last name, an email, a phone number, a status, and a birthday, so that you can call that person on their birthday and wish them happy birthday. So this is something that we call master detail view. One final thing is the filter that we can use to filter the persons that are displayed in the grid. So let's start typing like Jeff. There's no one with that name. But there's Jennifer. No Jenny, okay. And yeah, the last thing is that you can also add new customers. So it's the same form that is used to edit existing persons, and that's it. So yeah, let's take a look on that from the back end. So let's start with our entity that we use. So for those of you who don't know Grails, defining entities in Grails is quite simple thanks to GORM, Grails object relational mapping. So the way you define a new entity is just creating a new class, listing all the properties with in the Groovy code that you want it to have. You can add some constraints, and there is a specific DSL for that, and that's it. And Grails will actually take care of pretty much everything that you need to have it in the database, like creating the SQL scripts and so on, creating the if you're using Hibernate code for that, Hibernate mappings, it's all automatic. Would you like to tell a bit more about that, Jeff?
Yeah, so the specific part of Grails that you're talking about, as you said, is called GORM, which stands for the Groovy Object Relational Mapping Tool. And so there's a folder there under Grails-app called domain. And if you declare a class in that domain folder, GORM will automatically recognize that that class as a domain class because of where it's located. So that's an example of this really powerful idea that we take advantage of in a lot of places in the framework, and the idea is convention over configuration. So the convention in a Grails app is for all of your domain classes to be declared in that domain folder, and that does away with what otherwise would have been configuration work, where you've got to tell Hibernate about your entities. So you define a class under the domain folder and declare some properties like first name, last name, phone, and email. And GORM takes care of all the tedious stuff to configure the ORM tool, and you get to turn this on or off but it has the capability of auto-generating the schema in the database for you. So it really makes it very, very easy to define your domain and get started with development without having to monkey with DDL scripts to create tables and so forth. And then maybe even more important is we'll get to, as we move through the demo code here, we'll see that the code required to interact with the database, like to initiate queries, to update the database, GORM makes all that super duper simple. So I don't get too far ahead, but we'll see some of that coming up in source code.
Yeah, so actually let's move to the service that we're going to use to fetch those entities from the database that Grails will take care of for us. So this is a customer service. This is quite a powerful concept. I think it's the latest Grails release that introduced that with GORM. So you can define a service as an interface. So in this customer service, we've got a couple of methods defined. So first one is finding all the customers by their name, then saving a customer contact so that you can save the entity back to the database, and then saving an entity based on the particular properties of that entity. So what about that, Jeff? Could you tell a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting stuff. So notice that the thing that we're looking at there is an interface. It's not a class. So we've got an interface called customer service, and it's got these abstract methods in it that represent all of our interactions with the database. So in this simple app, really all we have to do is be able to query for customers and save customers. We might have more sophisticated things in a more robust application, but that's all we have to do in this app is retrieve them and save them. So GORM makes it really easy to generate the kind of the data layer of your application. You can write an interface like this, and so notice that the interface is annotated with @service customer. So GORM will recognize that at compile time, and at compile time will generate a class that implements this interface, and that class, of course, will have implementations for all of these methods. And based on some conventions that have to do with parameter names and method names and return types, based on some conventions here in this interface, GORM knows what each of these methods is supposed to do. So for example, the save method that accepts 7 or 8 parameters there, first name, last name, phone, and so forth, the parameter names there are important. That's what tells GORM which property to initialize, which each of those parameters. So when you call that save method and pass a string and a string and a string and so forth, all the necessary parameters, GORM will create a customer for you and populate all the corresponding properties with the parameter values that were passed into this method, and then persist that entity for you. So all you've got to write is this abstract method that defines, that represents one of the ways you want to save customers, and GORM can generate all the rest for you. And there's a whole bunch going on around this. There's a bunch of interesting transaction management stuff going on. This service will participate in the dependency injection container. There's a whole lot going on that's really, really interesting here. But for the sake of our conversation right now, one of the important points to note is how little code there is here, right? All we've defined are some abstract methods, and GORM is able to generate our data layer based on what's in these abstract methods. And this particular case is really trivial and simple, but even for more robust interactions, this still ends up being very, very simple. It's awesome stuff.
Yeah, it is. The next awesome stuff is that the nice thing that you can see here is that, let's say that so when we start the application, you can see that it already has some data loaded. So there is this nice file in the init folder of the Grails application that is called Bootstrap, which you can use to bootstrap your application. So in this case, what we're doing here is we're just generating some random, well, not actually random because we use the same seed all the time, but we generate some additional data that we can then, by using customer service, we can put into the application, so that when the application starts in the development mode, it actually already has some data for you to work with and to play with. So you don't have to think about how to get your database filled in with some data for the development. You can just put this kind of code into the Bootstrap class, and it will be there for you. You can do much more with Bootstrap, but
we should look at, scroll up just a little bit so we can see where the customer service is declared in the Bootstrap class.
yeah, so
And notice that all that we're doing there is declaring the property of type customer service. Notice that that's not being initialized. It doesn't say customer service equals something. And also remember that customer service is an interface, not a class. So we can't tell from looking at this code what the concrete type of the customer service property is going to be. But what it is it's going to be an instance of the class that GORM generated for us that implements that customer service interface. And we can just interact with it without having to know the concrete type. We just know that customer service is something that implements the customer service interface. So those save methods and those query methods we looked at a minute ago will be there, but we don't have to know details about the concrete implementation. And that's a benefit. One of the benefits of using dependency injection or inversion of control is we don't need to know details about the concrete implementation. And that's another benefit of the way the GORM data services stuff is put together is everything stays super simple around all of that.
Yeah. So let's move to the starting point of the application, to the Grails UI class. So as I said before, there's one method that you need to implement that will set up the application for the user. That's init method, and inside this init method, we're doing just a couple of things. So we're setting up the UI. So we need to have a layout. This is basically a component that can accept other components and display them in a specific in a specific layout. So actually, this horizontal layout will lay those components from top to bottom, right? From left to right. Vertical layout is another kind of layout that will lay components from top to bottom, and then there are other layouts available from the framework as well. One of the most commonly used is the CSS layout. It just flows the components from left to right and wraps them if it is needed, but it allows you to use custom CSS to position those components. So if you have some more advanced positioning requirements, you can use CSS layout for that, and the framework doesn't prevent you from using CSS for that. Okay, so then we tell the main layout that it should take as much space as possible. The nice thing about Vaadin is that layouts, the horizontal layout, the vertical layout, the form layout, those layouts actually automate the positioning for you. So you just can tell that it should be that big, or it should take as much space as possible, or it should be as compressed as possible, and that's it. So you don't need to fiddle with CSS or with some calculations or anything like that. You don't need to use pixels. It will just work. Okay.
So it's great that you don't have to write the CSS to when you're building out your UI. If you wanted to tweak the CSS, does Vaadin provide a mechanism to get there?
Yeah, so basically you need to declare a specific CSS class in your theme, and then you need to attach this class to the component that you have. So there is this, like, let's say we want to have the grid styled in a specific way. There is add style name method. And this method accepts the name of the class that you declared in your CSS. And then you can use the CSS for whatever changes you want to make.
Nice.
So yeah, and we've got the grid. The grid is the data grid that is being displayed right here. And we need to define columns for it. So we're using something that is called contact value provider. This stems from the fact that if we weren't using Grails entity, just a simple data transfer object for the grid, then we would even not need that code. So we could just tell the grid that this is the type of the entities that you're going to display, or the type of the beans. Figure it out yourself. What are the accessors? What are the getters and setters? And display that and that list of beans in the grid. But since we're using a customer entity, this entity is enriched by GORM, and GORM adds some additional getters and setters that shouldn't be called. And unfortunately, right now grid works that way, that it calls those getters and setters, and if you try to use just naked entity, you will get an exception. But we're going to work it around. So one way of doing that is subclassing the grid and telling the grid how it should operate with this specific kind of beans, and that's something that I hopefully will be able to do pretty soon. Okay, then as we have this grid, we tell the grid that it should behave as a single select, so there's only one item that you can select. You can have a grid that works as multi-select, but you need to specifically call this method grid as multiple select. But right now we're making it a single select, and we add a value change listener to it, so that when the user actually clicks on the item from the grid, we display the form for editing the item. If they click again, they deselect the grid, so the value of the grid is now null, and the customer form is not being displayed. We've got a button that the user can use to add a new customer. So again, we clear the selection on the browser, and then we create a new excuse me. We create a new customer object so that it will be used as a data backend for the form. And
so since those event listeners are written in Groovy here, or could be any other JVM language, as opposed to having to write the JavaScript yourself, does that mean you could put breakpoints in these event handlers and,
yes.
And step through this code?
Yes, exactly. That's one of the benefits of using Vaadin. The debugging part is really easy, because you just need to attach the debugger to the servlet container, and that's it. If you want to debug the client side of the Vaadin application, this might be a bit more complicated, because you still would need to use the browser debugger for JavaScript. But there are quite nice tools nowadays for that, like Chrome Web Developer Tools, and by using Google Web Toolkit, you can still actually debug the Java code. If you're using IntelliJ, there's a nice plugin for IntelliJ that hooks into the browser and allows you debugging from the IntelliJ debugger and not in the browser. So this is really powerful stuff.
Sure.
Okay, so we've got this click listener, and then the last thing is setting up the filter, the text field that we use to filter the items that are displayed in the data grid. So let's type John here, and you can see it filters the items based on whether the first name or last name contains the text that I typed into the text field. Right. So this is quite simple. The last thing that I want to show is the update list method that just uses the contact service. So we have this contact service defined here, and we need to have it annotated with auto-wired. So this is basically Spring Boot annotation. Spring annotation. That's because we're not using anything more than just Spring Boot integration for Vaadin, right? So there isn't any plugin or anything like that that would take care of figuring out the conventions for the developer. So we need to have this auto-wired annotation, but Spring Boot that is in Grails will actually take care of injecting that customer service instance for us into the UI, and it will have proper scope. It will work out of the box, so we can use this service to either find all by name or in the customer form to save that customer or to delete that customer. So yeah, it's 5 p.m. in Finland, so I think we need to wrap it up. There are no questions in the forum so far, but hopefully people will watch the webinar and ask questions there. I will be more than happy to answer those. Thank you, Jeff, for your time. Would you like to add something?
I do see a question that just showed up in the live chat that might be worth addressing. So,
okay.
Douglas is asking if Vaadin is stateless.
No.
I think that's something to clarify.
No, Vaadin is not stateless at all. I mean, we do keep the state on the server side. We need to keep the state so that it all works. So it's not a stateless framework.
Right.
The state of the application is being kept on the server side, and the only code that can change this state is executed on the server side, which means that the application is actually safe, because even if you have a user that fiddles with JavaScript on the browser and tries to change something, the browser is only a rendering tool for Vaadin, so it only uses Vaadin only uses browser to render the application and communicate changes in the state from the server side to the client side. But there are no changes in the state communicated from client side to the server side. Instead, we're using RPCs that's remote procedure calls. We have an implementation of RPCs that is our own, and it's quite secure. So if there is something that the server side knows that shouldn't be displayed in the browser, for example, and there is a malicious user that uses JavaScript to interact with the component that is hidden, the framework will notice that and will not allow this kind of integration, this kind of interaction. So, yeah, I hope that answered this question.
Yeah, I think so. You mentioned Vaadin 10 that you're working on. That's a GWT-less solution. Do you have are you far enough along there to have a time frame in mind for when you might be able to ship RCs or the release?
So the developer preview is already available. We actually announced it on Java 1, and the idea is that we get the production ready production ready version of the platform ASAP. So we're fixing different issues. We're still adding features that people ask for. You can start using it right away, and if there is something that comes to your mind, tickets in our GitHub are more than welcome.
Very good. Well, I encourage folks to visit github.com/grails-samples and find the Vaadin demo project there. And you can check it out of the repo and run it without making any code changes. Just run gradle w boot run. The thing will start up like a typical Spring Boot app or Grails 3 application would start up. And then take a look at the application in the browser and look at the source code and see how little there is in the source code. But that sample app, I think, is a good kind of first step for folks who are wanting to see what all this looks like. Either maybe Vaadin users who are new to Grails 3, or the other way around, Grails users who are not familiar with Vaadin. I think that's a great resource for folks to use as kind of a next step to start tinkering with your technology.
Yeah, and there will be articles coming on our website pretty soon, expanding on this tutorial. So. Yeah, please come back and we'll let you know. We've got your emails.
Yeah, you're doing great work, Mac. Thanks for taking time to introduce all this. I've found it interesting, and I know the community will have as well. So thank you very much. I think we've introduced some really interesting technology to a lot of folks.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.